Public expectations about the year ahead are bleaker than they've been in more than a decade. A new Washington Post-ABC poll finds just 53% of all Americans are hopeful about what 2013 will bring. Fears of falling off the fiscal cliff are fueling this pessimism. 45% think it's unlikely a budget deal will be reached between the president and Congress. But NBC News' political director, Chuck Todd, says despite that possibility, going for a small, stripped-down agreement isn't all good.
I think politically the president's making a mistake to go for a small deal. He will lose leverage as the year goes on. He'll get a big political victory. But he should try one more time for the big deal. You had nearly 200 House Republicans about to vote to raise taxes on millionaires.
Joining me now, former Congressman Joe Sestak, Democrat of Pennsylvania, and Republican strategist David Winston, former senior advisor to the Newt Gingrich campaign. Thank you both for being here today, and I'll start with you here, Congressman. Does the president's ability to get what he wants diminish over time? Should he go big one more time?
He should go big for the American people. It's not about him and his leverage. I think the president, as steward of this economy, needs to try to reach the big compromise with Speaker O'Boehner. And the two men came very close. They're only a few $100 billion away. We know what we need, $3 trillion in debt reduction over the next decade. We already have $1 trillion from caps on discretionary spending reached in 2011. And we know how we have to do it. 2/3 of it has to be in spending reductions, entitlement reform, and 1/3 of it has to be in tax increases on the wealthy. That's the principal compromise. Speaker Boehner needs to bring his party along, and the Speaker has to make sure that his party understands why we need entitlement reform.
Congressman,
because the damage is going to be to our children if we don't do this, Richard.
Can they do it in a handful of days ahead of them, though?
Well, look, you don't have to get that part done in the next couple of weeks. That has to be done by about the middle of February, to where the markets start to get jittery, particularly if we don't address our debt ceiling. If in the next few weeks he gets the short-term agreement as part of it, to where that $700 billion, Richard, that we're going to have in spending increases and tax increases and spending cuts, if that goes into place and we don't reduce that down to $200 billion, we can't sustain our gross domestic product rate at 2%. That agreement has to be part of the overall grand compromise. It's a two-step approach, or combine them as one. But we get that first part, that first step in January. The second part in February will be okay.
Now, let's talk small as we go to David here. David, on the flip side here, you look at Speaker Boehner. Doesn't he come away with less with a smaller deal? I mean, in a series of sort of small agreements or cliff agreements, the tax increases would be more than if he had agreed to the 2011 deal.
Well, again, going back to what Joe was just saying, I mean, I think the idea here, what both want to do is they want to get to this bigger deal. Because, look, this is a huge problem here. I mean, we're looking at a $1.3 trillion deficit for this year. And we're looking at deficits of that size as far as the eye can see. And so this is not just simply how do you put together some minor package, as Chuck was talking about. This is really how do you get to the larger deal. The problem you have, obviously, is there's not much time. And so I think you're likely to see a two-step process here. One, sort of dealing with sort of the immediate dynamics so that you can, in fact, set up a situation where you can deal with the larger situation. But ultimately here, the other element that has to occur is this has got to be a real negotiating process. I have to say I was disappointed in the president when he used that line when the speaker said to him, hey, I'm giving you $800 billion in terms of tax cuts. What do I get? And the president's response was nothing. The White House has got to come up with a better attitude.
The response from the White House says times are different. 2011 was 2011. But going back to the smaller deal, doesn't Speaker Boehner get less out of a smaller deal? Shouldn't he also agree to have a large agreement here?
No. I think he definitely wants a larger deal. And again, when you go back to August of 2011, they got very close to that large deal. But Richard, I'm going to push back a little bit in terms of look, you know, this is a negotiating process. One side just can't simply say to the other side, you get nothing after you've made a concession. I mean, that's the difficulty of this, and part of what the two of them have to do is work through this sense of I won, no, I can do this. It's what are we going to get done collectively, and that's going to be the challenge. And the president, and I understand he thinks he won the election, so therefore he has a mandate, but you can't walk into a negotiating process like that and expect to get to a successful outcome with that attitude.
So I think it looks like both sides, both of you agree that they need to work together. However, where you're pointing fingers is a little bit different. To you, Congressman, about these doomsday predictions, looking at the cliff, and if you were listening to our conversation earlier with Jared Bernstein, you might say that they could be overblown. What's your thought here? I mean, the cuts that will happen because of the sequester and the tax increases, they're fairly incremental. I mean, so who gains if these concerns are really greater than the actualities? The Democrats?
No, neither side gains. Who really loses is the American people. I always remember Speaker Boehner said the wisest words I ever heard anyone say in the House of Representatives when he handed the gavel to Nancy Pelosi to become Speaker of the House. As this was after Republicans lost that 2006 election, he said, "My party forgot. The power is to be used for the good of the people, not for power's sake." And that's what both President Obama and Speaker Boehner have to remember. Now, as far as that fiscal cliff, if they can withhold the tax schedule changes, they are able, like in defense, when you have a defense cut or a defense cut like that, it takes place over 3 to 4 years. It doesn't all happen this first year. So what we really want to make it is a bunny slope, not a real fiscal cliff. So the damage is not going to be great as long as if in the first month or two we are able to take this short-term step that David spoke about. So my take is what everybody is looking for, the consumer as well as the business investor, is certainty that Congress can generate the principle, the political will with the president to address our problem, both in the grand scheme, so we get $4 trillion in debt reduction over the next year, and second, in the short term, so we don't have our gross domestic product grow at 0 over the next year.
David, quickly to you here now. When you think about this entire issue, there is the GOP caucus and the dysfunctionality that appeared to be out there with Plan B. How does the Speaker get this done? How does he come out looking like a winner if they come up with some compromise?
Well, I mean, part of what you need to remember is that over 90% of the Republican caucus was going with the Speaker on this. Again, you had a handful of members, some of them disgruntled in terms of the whole situation, in terms of committee assignments. But basically, he had over 90% of the caucus going with him, but he had no Democratic votes in that particular case. Now, as we move closer, you may see that dynamic, at least in terms of the Democratic side, change. But again, I mean, he had solid support here. But I want to go back to one of the point that the Congressman was bringing up before, and that is, look, the real solution here that we've got to get to is how do we get this economy growing again? The best way to deal with the deficit is to have an unemployment rate of 4%, so you have people paying taxes in the economy that's really booming. And ultimately, one of the challenges to both individuals here, both the President and the Speaker, is how do you put together a plan that's going to generate that kind of economic growth and generate that kind of employment? Because I worked for the Speaker back in the late 90s when we balanced the budget, and what really made this happen is when you have unemployment under 4%, guess what? You can do a lot of things.
Yeah, some are saying the magic number is 350,000 new jobs a month. We will hope for any number above what we've got right now, certainly. Former Congressman Joe Sestak and Republican strategist David Winston, thanks for your time. The upper chamber of Russia's parliament voted to ban Americans from adopting